Well, good afternoon. It was nice to listen to Professor Healy before this class, because when I was listening to him and he was describing the attitudes about freedom of speech in the US during World War I, during the Sedition Act, I said, oh, I know this very well. Because this is exactly where we are in other parts of the world, in many other parts of the world, and including my country, which is Turkey. In Turkey today, for example, there are terrorist groups that target the government. That's a legitimate threat. That's a real threat. But if you criticize the way the government deals with the terrorist groups, you can easily be targeted as the supporter of terrorists. And I was surprised, positively in a sense, that, US had a similar attitude a century ago. At least, it's not just us Turks, or even Americans had these kind of, limitations on free speech, but there was progress. And the progress was made possible by brave people who lobbied on, judges and brought liberal ideas and so on and so forth. If liberal ideas are somehow universal, at least to some extent, I believe in that. So this means that, there's room for progress everywhere. Which brings me to our speaker today, Serdar Kaya, who's a good friend of mine, longtime friend of mine. And Serdar is a Turkish academic from Turkey. He studied first in Turkey, then he did his PhD in Simon Fraser University in Canada, where he's still teaching. He conducted postdoc studies in Australia, so he's a global Turkish, academic turned global. And so he has that on his resume. But I also value his work as a public intellectual in Turkey. Like me, Serdar has been one of the tiny small group of Turkish liberals who are generally hated by all major political camps because we criticize all of them. And he has taken very brave positions within the Turkish political sphere, Turkish intellectual sphere. He's one of the, and we are both critiques of authoritarianism, and I think he goes way more than me. I said, wow, you're braver than me. I sometimes have said that. I mean, he has, for example, stood aside and said what happened to Armenians was absolutely a genocide, for example. You see, I'm shaking around saying that. That's a kind of a hot topic issue, so he defended positions like that. He criticized Turkish nationalism, Kurdish nationalism. He defended Muslim culture a lot, authoritarianism within Muslim culture. And he also, for example, wrote a book defending the right of Charlie Hebdo to publish cartoons of Prophet Muhammad. And he wrote a book about this. He said, this is not hate speech, this is not criminal speech. Charlie Hebdo has the right to publish these cartoons. And when Serdar was writing this book, he was writing also for an ostensibly liberal website, Turkish website, called Serbestiyet. But the argument proved too liberal for this website, so Serdar couldn't continue to write anymore. And when he was publishing the book in Turkish, he couldn't put the cartoons in there, so instead of that, he will show you today, I think, they put a kind of a, you have this kind of scan, what do you call it?
Don't spoil the circle.
Okay, I was spoiled. Okay. So it's been an issue whether you can really defend the right of the magazine Charlie Hebdo to publish the cartoons and even speak about them in Turkey, and Serdar bravely did that. He also, has been bold in Twitter and social media and other his articles in daily press about, I guess, basically any authoritarian political camp in Turkey, which are plenty. So, therefore, we are very happy to have Serdar today to speak us about all these complications, the state of freedom of speech in the Muslim world, which is challenged for a lot of reasons. And I think he has some arguments, some criticisms about the state of freedom in the West as well, which are also important. So, therefore, join me please welcoming Serdar Kaya, Dr. Serdar Kaya.
Do I still count as Turkish?
You do.
That I am not sure. I roughly lived the first half of my life in Turkey. I was born there. The second half, I first lived in the States for 6 years. Then the second half is roughly in North America. And then I migrated to Canada. I'm a dual citizen. If it continues like that, I may become a single citizen again, but that would be Canadian, I guess, because it seems to be more problematic now. Carrying a Turkish passport seems to be more of a liability than a document that comes with a set of rights. So the duty part sort of goes over the rights, but that's roughly me. I don't know. I lived in 4 countries so far. I try to be a globally minded person, and I think it's best if we distance ourselves from our backgrounds just so we can see things more objectively. And when it comes to his praises about me, I don't think I'm really that brave, because when all of the other people were writing criticizing the Turkish government and previous Turkish governments and their atrocities, they were doing that in Turkey. Speaking truth to power when you're going to be judged by the laws of that power is more difficult than simply being in your office or being in your home on your comfortable couch and writing about things that happen halfway around the world. So that's different. So if I was there, could I still write that? I'm not sure. Maybe I could, maybe I wouldn't, or maybe I wouldn't do it to such an extent. And coming to today's talk, it's about, let's see, it's going to be in 3 parts. In the first part, I'm going to quickly summarize the whole controversy around the cartoons, first in Denmark and then with Charlie Hebdo. And I will go to the responses of the Turkish media to the attack to Charlie Hebdo offices where the cartoonists and a few other people were killed. And then these responses are actually what led to my book project. So I will simply give you a background on things, and then I pass to the second part, which compares free speech to hate speech, and where we draw the line is going to be where the major focus is going to be. And in the last part, I will try to look at the general trends in the world today, in the Western world and the Islamic world. But it's not really, 2018 is probably not the best year for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, with the rise of far right-wing, rise in the support for far right-wing governments in Europe, and having some of that sentiment in the United States, and what goes on in the Middle East and other places, the wars, other things. So it's not really the best year. It's not really a year where we can be really hopeful about the future. But still, what's really going on? I'm going to give 2 examples from Canada, 2 very recent examples actually, about how the freedom of speech and expression can be restricted to large extents, even in campuses. And then I will try to wrap it up and open it up for questions and try to elaborate on any slides you see there that I will simply summarize, and we can have a chat about these things. Mostly I will be providing you with facts, but in the Q&A we can talk about things in a more normative or subjective manner. So here it goes. First, the cartoons controversy and the story of my book. The Danish cartoons controversy. A very quick summary of what happened in Denmark in 2005. A Danish author decided to write a book on Islam for children. Okay, so far so good. Then what happened? Then what happened was, well, if you have a book, at one point you're going to, of course, start to think about the power, and so did he. But the people, the artists he contacted seemed to be reluctant about drawing Muhammad in the cover. So that puzzled him a little. And one of these on one of his TV appearances, he mentioned that. He said, well, I'm having difficulty finding an artist who's willing to draw Muhammad for the cover of my book. So that started a media debate. I mean, what's going on? The question was, what is the actual degree of self-censorship in Denmark and perhaps also in Europe right now, was the question. And Jyllands-Posten, a center right-wing newspaper, decided to test this by running an experiment. And what kind of an experiment that was? They contacted 42 cartoonists to draw cartoons of Muhammad the way they saw him. So they did not give them any instructions as to what the contents of these cartoons would be. They just asked them to draw, 42 people. And only 12 of them accepted the invitation. And on September 30th, 2005, the newspaper published them all on this page, which is now sort of famous, one of the most famous newspaper pages. So you see all of these cartoons surrounding a text, which is the presentation of the project. And not a lot of people know this. How we remember the past is often inaccurate to some degree, so that's the case for this one too. Most of us remember these events that happened 13 years ago now. Like, these were published and then all hell broke loose. No, it didn't happen like that. These were published and then they raised some eyebrows and they were quickly forgotten, actually. What happened was, two imams in Denmark, Abu Leban and Akari, created a 43-page dossier. They included the cartoons in it with some inflammatory remarks, and they included another 3, which had nothing to do with the Jyllands-Posten. They were fabrications, and they were irrelevant, actually. They had nothing to do with Islam. And then they went on a tour of, I think, North Africa and the Middle East to mobilize people so as to get their reaction against the cartoons. And they were successful. So after 3 months or so, we started to see riots and protests. In Muslim countries, for example, in front of Danish embassies, and sometimes in countries like Nigeria, where more than 100 people were killed because of their tensions there, anyways, between the south and north of the country, which is Muslim and Christian. So that is the background. Interesting fact I can include at this point. Years later, Akari, one of the 2 imams, actually apologized. He said he was in his 20s at the time. He didn't really have a full understanding of the issues, and what he did was wrong. I think I included that in the readings, so you can get the details from them, which I found interesting, and many of them did actually. One of the cartoonists, actually, he apologized in person, and that was the person who drew the most controversial one at the very top to the right, the one that depicts Prophet Muhammad with an explosive in his turban. So that was long story short. And what about Charlie Hebdo? Well, a lot of people say a lot of things about Charlie Hebdo. Most of them are not true. And if we're going to have a minimal understanding of what Charlie Hebdo is about, I sort of shortened the list down to 3. First of all, it's a left-wing newspaper or magazine. How you see it, I don't know. So they keep calling it magazine. I see it like they keep calling it a newspaper. I tend to see it like a weekly magazine. But regardless, it's left-wing in its content, but it's more like the left wing of the earlier, 60s, 70s, very anti-colonial, very anti-racist. And it keeps ridiculing and criticizing the French right. That's the first thing that Charlie Hebdo probably is about, because that's what you see when you look at the covers, when you look at the inside pages. So anti-religious character of Charlie Hebdo comes only second to this, and it's criticism and ridicule of all religions. Not at all just Islam. Actually, there is a content analysis of Charlie Hebdo for 10 years, and in the covers, there were only like 7-9 covers that criticized, that was, anti-Islam in a way. And third, it's no holds barred sarcasm. That's the kind of humor that it uses. That's, of course, a choice, but that makes it difficult to understand sometimes the content or the message of the cartoons in Charlie Hebdo. Now, 3 examples to these 3 characteristics. The first one you see, Marine Le Pen. That's the leftist. It says in translation, a Joan of Arc who burns others at the stake. Well, instead of, a Joan of Arc who died at the stake, burns others at the stake. And at the stake you see a person who looks, a stranger, a foreigner, who looks, exactly like how North Africans are depicted. So that's actually a criticism of the anti-right position of Charlie Hebdo, and criticism of the anti-right in terms of its xenophobia. And the second one would be the anti-religious. I choose that one because it says all religions to the crapper, but you see all 3 books, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, being equated to toilet paper rather than just one, which is to, you may agree or disagree with this, but this is to reflect the idea that this is how Charlie Hebdo is. It is not really focusing only on Islam. It's not even focusing primarily or secondarily on Islam. And the third, the satirical part, which makes it difficult for Charlie Hebdo to convey its message, especially to those who are not familiar with the magazine or that type of humor in general. It says the proof that Europe is Christian. Christians walk on water, Muslim children sing. That was, of course, a reference to the Syrian kid who drowned off the shore of Turkey trying to reach Greece. Of course, Charlie Hebdo is not saying, well, of course, Christianity works, Islam doesn't. No, it simply says, well, this is the double standard of Europe when it comes to treating non-Western immigrants and Western immigrants, something along these lines. Well, and an interesting fact is that Charlie Hebdo is anti-Islam, but it's at times quite pro-Muslim. You see on the left, for example, a cartoon by Sharp, who was murdered in the attack. Do you still recognize Palestine is the question in there. And it's pro-Palestinian, this first one. The second one is published after the previous offices of Charlie Hebdo was firebombed. The details of which is coming in the next slide. So after they were firebombed because of their Sharia Hebdo special issue, that was the next cover. Love is stronger than hate. And you see an imam just enjoying a wet kiss with a Charlie Hebdo support drawer. A cartoonist probably given the pencil on the top of the cartoonist's ear. So that's basically Charlie Hebdo. That's business as usual when you look at the whole context. And then Muhammad cartoons in Charlie Hebdo. What kind of? Just to give you, I cover all of such cartoons in my book, but just to give you some idea about what kind of covers we're talking about, I included the ones that are probably among the most famous. So in here you see, the text on the left-hand side, top left corner, says Muhammad is bored of fundamentalists, and he's depicted as saying, "It is difficult to be loved by idiots." Now in this case, you can make the argument it's pro-Islam and anti-radical Muslim, because the fact that the Prophet is depicted like this is enough to anger a lot of people. That's one thing. But the other thing is, if you look at the content, it is simply differentiating between the founder of the religion and some Muslims who resort to violence in the name of the same religion. So that's what one of the, and there's a video actually on YouTube, I think you can find it, where, and you can witness this one being, this is a piece of history now, and you can witness it being drawn. And as they talk around the table among themselves, they ask, what can we do? Is it okay if we, draw him? What if we draw him with his, not his face, maybe covering his face with his hands? And that's how the idea is born for this particular cover. And then you see it being written, but most of these people who sat around that, in 2006 were murdered in 2015, so that video became a more important at this point. Let's look at another example, and that's the special issue Sharia Hebdo. If you can look at the sort of the title being replaced by Sharia Hebdo, in which supposedly Muhammad was the editor-in-chief for the special issue, and then there were several cartoons in the issue, and the title says, and the cover says, 100 lashes if you do not die of laughter. And that angered a lot of people. So about a day before, I guess, this hit newsstands, the offices were firebombed. They moved to the latest location after this one, and this is Sharp, the editor-in-chief, who was murdered. He didn't draw this one. But that's the story of this particular cover, anyways. But 4 years after this, the new offices that they moved to were attacked by 2 gunmen. And I visited the place 11 months after the incident, so it didn't look any different at all. No monuments, no nothing. It was, if you didn't know that this was the Charlie Hebdo building, you could just walk past by. But the only thing I could see was what you see in the corner, the drawings of 5 people who were killed in the attack. And this introduction brings us to the response of the Turkish media, specifically to the shooting. So 3 titles there. The first one, conspiracy theories, basically say that it was the Western powers who committed that. And it was in fact an attack against Islam. The second one was blaming the victim, as I called it. Charlie Hebdo was asking for it, and it was a long time coming. And the last one, it was, to me, it was utter ignorance or defamation. I don't know which, but I will show you examples. They claim that Charlie Hebdo made fun of rape victims in Bosnia and the massacres in Bosnia, when in fact it is quite the other way around. So just to give you an example, that's a moderate example. This is a moderate Islamic newspaper, and it simply says, the title calls everyone to be rational about this. But in the bottom, in these two lines in gray, it reads, the freedom of expression does not include insulting sacred values, but that's on the one hand, but on the other, response to such provocations cannot be terror and violence, which Islam rejects. So first, the newspaper makes the claim that there's no question, sort of, that the freedom of expression does not cover criticism, perhaps, or well, no, it says insulting sacred values. But the second part is, well, of course, it's quite reasonable. The response to insults should not be violence and terror. And they add to this that Islam rejects these two. A more extreme example, that would be another Islamic newspaper, but that, I don't know, would it be a meaningful comparison if I said this is more like the Fox News of Islamists in Turkey, maybe? I don't know.
Breitbart.
Well, maybe that too. Yeah, that's another one that you can say. And of course, the language is stronger. It says it is actually the West who did this. And in the bottom it says it's 12 people who died in France. That's what they mention. And after the incident, the suppression of Muslim minorities in Western countries is now an increase. And specialists say the real perpetrator of the act is the Western world, which simply watches as hundreds of Muslims die every day. So that, of course, gives us a false comparison. Like 12 people died and then hundreds of Muslims die every day. Even if we consider that to be true, I mean, this is a false comparison. It's a logical fallacy. You cannot say just because, or imply just because hundreds of people, hundreds of Muslims are killed every single day. Well, 12 is not really a big number. It's maybe justifiable if some cartoonists are shot and killed for what they drew. So but you can raise a lot of other criticisms too, but this is just to give you an idea about the responses. And finally, a third example would be, which I call either a slanderous or ignorant example. I'm leaning toward ignorant because I see a lot of ignorance in what's being written in the West, in the Islamic world, other places. So that says Charlie Hebdo made fun of it's a massacre, but if you read the below text to see how they support it, you don't see anything concrete really. How this all happened was there's a Bosnian news journalist in Turkey, and she tweeted lots of these. She tweeted about this, a thread of tweets, and then she claimed that the covers of Charlie Hebdo that she included as attachments are actually making fun of the massacres and rapes. That's why I included this very set of cartoons in my book and analyzed their content, and included another one that she didn't cover, and simply tried to demonstrate that it is quite the other way around. They're simply saying that the UN is useless, and how the UN watched all these things happen, and how the Serbs are to blame for all these rapes, so on and so forth. So what I decided to do after I saw all of these things, I'm sorry, I gave you 3 examples here, 1, 2, 3. Once I saw all of these things, I decided to write a series of articles about them. At the time I was writing, for a website, and it was 20. There were 22, I guess, writers on that. We all wrote for the same national newspaper in Turkey at one point. That's what connected us and led to this project. And we all left at the same time because of the changes we saw in the editorial independence of the newspaper. So in protest, we left altogether, and then we created an email group. We asked each other, what are we going to do now? And then the conclusion we reached was to just create a website and write there, and it's going to be our website, so nobody can have a say on what we write, and we will be completely free. And the name of the website in translation is freedom.org. Was it org or com? I don't even remember now. That was a few years ago. So that's how the project started. I was already writing there. But once these things happened, I said, okay, I'm always writing in series anyways. I start on one issue. I write about the different aspects of it. So why don't I do the same thing for these cartoons? I wrote 6 articles, but the 7th one was published, but shortly after its publication, they removed it from the site. Well, who removed it from the site? A subgroup of our group, that is, now the editors, thought it was a bit too controversial to include the cartoons themselves on the website.
The next slide you did.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So it was okay for me to include, analyze the content of the cartoons, but it was not okay for me to include the cartoons next to them. To me, my response was, well, that's like being blindfolded. If you are the reader, you don't see what is the object there that's being analyzed. So you're just trying to figure it out, like there's this and this, and then on the left there is this. Is that what I'm supposed to do? They will not see it, and then they will try to figure it out to the best of their ability from the way I describe it. So that was simply not... this is not what we signed up for in the first place, was my response. So I simply left. They did not, ask me to leave. I left. I didn't want to be a part of it any longer because, I can do it on my own blog if I want to, and nobody's gonna, I won't have to think about who's gonna say what. So I left. But what the articles published there, the first 6 ones did, was to start with the Jyllands-Posten, the 12 Jyllands-Posten cartoons, and then continue with Charlie Hebdo, to simply let people know what these cartoons are about, what message they're conveying. Okay, this is the cartoon, this is the translation, this is the context to it, and this is the message. So this was quite factual, actually. What pissed me a little, to be honest, is that many of my co-columnists at the time did not see the difference between publishing something. A publisher may choose not to publish Muhammad cartoons, but if I am to analyze them, there's a difference between publishing them it's more like an in-your-face attitude, or silently and quietly and calmly simply saying, well, these are the cartoons, this is what they mean, so if we're going to debate this issue, let's first know what exactly we're talking about. That's different to me, at least. But they were not of the same idea, so it didn't work. Oh, it's .com, now I know. All right, so the 7th one, they removed from the website. They asked me to remove them, and then, and I didn't do that, I just left. But I decided to. This was, I think, 2015, January. But I published these 7 articles between January and April 2015. After then, I decided to, okay, it's okay if they don't want to publish it. I can expand this into a book. I can provide even more details in a book. And it's going to be up there. Whoever is interested in knowing what these cartoons were really about in Denmark and then in France, they can, it can be a reference book. So that's how it started. But it was not really a smooth process, because many of the people I contacted were reluctant to publish the book, especially if the cartoons were to be included alongside the text. But even without them, they were, these are sensitive times, so we should probably give this one a pass. But finally, Liber Plus, as it's called, a pro-liberty publisher, agreed to do it in August 16. So it took more than 1 year, actually, for me to find someone a bit brave enough to do this. And then after their approval, I simply resumed my work and submitted them the finalized manuscript December 16. And a little less than a year ago, it was published. And you see the cover here, which depicts sort of how you can have a pen, but you cannot really write with it the things that you want to write. Now, did we or did we not publish the cartoons? Did you spoil the surprise?
I didn't spoil that, yeah.
Did we or did we not publish them?
You should explain that. I didn't spoil it.
All right. Let's put it up for vote. Did we publish them? This Liber Plus guys, were they really, like Charlie Hebdo, or did they not publish them? Who says we published them? We were, of course, very...
Somewhere in between.
Who says, no, you probably didn't publish them? All right, you're both correct. Because what we did was, let me show you the image and you figure it out. So on the left-hand side, you see a cover from Charlie Hebdo, which actually does not include Muhammad, so it's fine, they published it. But if it did actually include him, what to do? I mean, this still puzzles me, okay? This doesn't make any sense to me. Not the fact that we use QR codes. No, not that. What puzzles me is, well, if you have a smartphone, you just use it, and then it's right on your screen. Why is that okay? Then, am I getting the message across? Like, how is that different from putting the actual image on the page? People feel somehow better if you don't put it there and use something like that.
Is it because you can opt out of seeing it?
Yeah.
If someone were offended, would be otherwise offended if they turned the page and boom, it was there.
Yeah, maybe that. Maybe, when you see it, the first few seconds of it, oh my God, I saw this. I don't know. I'm not that person, so I can only imagine.
It has to do with the printing company. They were not directly involved with the image, so the liability is not on their head. They did not physically print the image.
Yeah, what we discussed this way before, this was in a position to be published anyways, before even I finished writing the book. So this seemed, even to me and to the publisher, a good middle, hybrid solution sort of. But still, even if I get that this is less controversial, I cannot understand why this is less controversial. And you can do another thing. You see a short URL there. Right now, you can put simply bit.ly/hebdo51, and you get this. And it's simply going to redirect to my personal website where the cartoons are, both of them, both the QR code and the short URL there. Simply go. So it's okay if it's on my site, but not okay. And it's sort of better if you see the QR code. But the answer is, again, yes and no. That's how we sort of overcame this problem.
The difference was that the publisher is in Turkey and you're in Canada. So
That may be another thing.
under threat in Turkey, you will be fine in Canada with your web.
That's possible. So I lost some of my Turkish ways probably. Or never managed to quite acquire them in the first place. That was the problem maybe, I don't know. So the second part, what constitutes hate speech? And if something constitutes hate speech, what should we do about it, if anything? So commonly imposed limits to free speech. What are we talking about? Sedition, of course, you cannot really endanger the well-being of a government. Governments don't tend to not like that very much. And in the context of the United States, it's either, if you look at the history of freedom of speech in the United States, it's either anti-draft speech during the Vietnam War, for example, or the fear of communism. False speech, well, if you say wrong things about, spread lies about a group of people, for example, is that okay? Incitement of anger or violence, or both. Compelled speech, like the kind you see in high school classrooms, I pledge allegiance to the flag and this, that you have to, if you have to say it. Now, that's another form of, if it's not optional especially, that's another form of restriction on free speech because you're compelled to say something. But even if it's optional, maybe it's best to think about it. Like, there are millions of zillions of things that you may have an option to say every single day at school, but you're not given that option. You're given only one, and you're expected to say that word by word. Even that should raise some questions. And four more in here. Symbolic speech. Is it okay if I display a Nazi flag? Is it okay if I display it in a public place? Or is it better if I display it on my own lawn or my window? So all these differentiations, the people in the US Supreme Court, for example, have to think and differentiate between. So if you burn the flag, the symbolic speech, as you can see from the examples, you're not saying anything whatsoever. You're simply saying something which expresses a particular viewpoint. If you burn the flag, or if you display the American flag, but if you display it upside down, things like that, obscenity, nudity, pornography, things like that, blasphemy, and finally, hate speech, incitement of hatred towards social groups, especially vulnerable ones. It is not in U.S. law, really. I mean, to a certain extent, you can infer that from particular U.S. Supreme Court decisions, but it's not really there. It is there in Canada. So there you see it. Two things stand out, which I emphasized in here. It needs to incite hatred, but the Canadian law does not say a vulnerable group, any group, even if it's the majority, not the vulnerable. Don't incite hatred. Keep things cool. This is Canada type of attitude. And a breach of the peace. So once you incite hatred, if it's to an extent that a breach of the peace is possible, that's when it becomes a crime. But of course, that's the test. The second one is the test, because how are you going to draw the line? Maybe I simply express dislike. Dislike is not hate. It's more, or lack of sympathy. That would be a very conservative interpretation of this law. So the test is how likely is the breach of the peace. So what are we talking about when we say hate speech? Well, it can take many forms, some of which I mentioned in the previous slide. But it comes down to the two that I highlighted. And if we're not talking about Canada, it can refer to any vulnerable group. It can be race-based, it can be creed, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, given what women have gone through in all of male-dominated history. So, do Muhammad cartoons constitute hate speech is the question here. So, one question to approach this would be, do the published cartoons incite hatred against Muslim minorities in Western countries? Meaning, pick up the new issue of Charlie Hebdo, take a look at it. oh my God, I started hating Muslims already. Does that happen? If that happens, yes, incitement of hatred and a likely breach of the peace. The second question would be, is there a gray area between the hatred against Islam and the hatred against Muslims? Because these are two very different things. So who knows? Maybe the right wing in the United States and elsewhere is right about Islam, and the left wing is right about Muslims. It's very possible, but we do not see this differentiation to the extent that we probably should. So drawing the line about these gray areas and other issues, if they do, so the first question was, do Muhammad cartoons constitute hate speech? If they do, where do we draw the line? Because asking the second question, we cannot really come up with any accurate prescriptions to the problem. So we have two extremes there. At the top, you see the extreme deregulation, which would outlaw any, which would legalize any free expression of any negative sentiment against any social group. Say whatever you want about anyone. God will burn gays in hell. Jews are like this. They kill Christian kids for Passover rituals, to use their blood, things like that. Anything goes in this first one. In the opposite end of the spectrum, you would have extreme regulation. No expression of any negative sentiment against any social group or their common cultural characteristics. You cannot make fun of any social group. You cannot make fun of their cultures, their anything that identifies them, distinguishes them from other groups. So I think few people are on these two extremes. Most people are someplace in between, although they may be close to one of these two extremes. So the gray areas, how are we going to differentiate between dislike versus hatred? How are we going to differentiate between criticism and insult? What constitutes criticism? What constitutes insult? Then we have to, of course, define these terms and see which applies in what case. And finally, we can differentiate between less versus more likely breach of the peace. So this is basically the second part. These are the questions we have. And again, I'm giving you the facts so far and leaving any normative comments for the Q&A. And this is the last part. The state of free speech in the world today. I'm going to give you examples from, well, we already covered Turkey to a certain degree, which we may again further explore in the Q&A. But first, Canada. Two very recent incidents, and they happened in campuses, no less. So the first one, in Dalhousie, not too far away from here in Halifax, a university student leader made the following Facebook post. But before you read through it, last year was 2017. It was Canada 150, which means the 150th anniversary of the birth of Canada. It was big. If you go to Tim Hortons, which is our Starbucks, of course, the cops said Canada 150. It's everywhere, okay? But some people had a problem with that because the country is like, well, human presence in North America is about 19,000 years, goes back now 19,000 years. So some people had a problem with starting history with Canada because there's a pre-Canada history as well. So what about them? And the second issue they had with this is the Canadian history, not the current Canadian history, but the earlier atrocities in our past. Sort of is built on destroying what was there before. So the birth of Canada, again, not contemporary Canada, but the birth of Canada is sort of at the expense of pre-Canadian history. So a lot of people raised issues, huge debates. So what are we going to do? Campuses are great places to discuss these issues because people coming from different places, giving different inputs, different backgrounds, different ideological leanings, and then they say what to do. They voted on the issue, and the decision was to unlearn 150. I give you guys 30 seconds to read through it, and then we continue. Was that too? I can be a little more. Oh, you can't read it? I can read. Okay. Unlearn 150. At our most recent council meeting, councillors voted to abstain from the Canada 150 celebrations. We recognize that Canada Day and the Canada 150 celebrations are an act of ongoing colonialism that glorifies continued theft from and disenfranchisement of the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, Canada. Here in Halifax, it also includes the original name, but I don't want to mispronounce it. We study, work, and live on unceded and unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. Mi'kmaq is the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. It goes over north New Brunswick as well. It expands into outside of Nova Scotia area too. Mi'kmaq people who lived on this land for over 13,000 years. We stand in solidarity with Indigenous students and communities. We are committed to challenging and unlearning the narrative of Canada 150 and decolonizing education. So that was the post, and things happen sometimes after such posts. So let's see what happened. How many of you are familiar with the incident? Oh, that makes me sad. Very sad.
Other incidents in Canada, but I hadn't heard of this one.
Okay. No, what are you going to do? It's Canada, maybe not. All right. So, of course, there are other student groups as well, and that was the Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is the province in which Halifax and Dalhousie University is located in. So Nova Scotia, young progressive conservatives. If I was not to be objective, I would ask you as to whether there's a problem with that phrase, progressive conservative. But anyways, they said it's disappointing, but I'm going to be objective. I didn't say that now, did I? It is disappointing that the Dalhousie Student Union has voted to refuse to participate in any celebrations of Canada in our country's 150th year. As a government-funded institution, see, refer to government or history or past or our founding values, this, that, if you want. It's a very common way to silence people or silence dissent. As a government-funded institution and as one that represents thousands of students of diverse views and backgrounds, the Dalhousie Student Union should prioritize advocating for student issues, not attacking Canada. Moreover, and it goes like this, it was long, so I just saw that it says see more there. But that's the idea. They reacted to it, and they did not stop there. One of the students, oh, okay, that comes later. So others followed suit and reacted to Khan, the student union leader. And many told her to pack her bags due to her background. She was born in Halifax. She's Canadian, so she responded, well, if I came back to where I went back to where I came from, I would still be here because I'm from Halifax. But she's a Muslim student who wears the hijab, so she's sort of a visible minority, if we can call her that. And then that was enough for many people to tell her to pack her bags. If you don't like the way we have it here, we're a democracy. If you don't like the way we have it here, just go back to where you came from. So but she did not back down. She responded with the following. Oh, I have to read this now? Can you read? All right, thank you. Because she mentions genocide there, and Canada has recognized that in the reservation schools where residential schools where which separated Native American kids from their parents. Many of them were raped and lots of things happened. So it was a deculturation process, and Canada apologized and mentions this over and over again. So she says, be proud of this country for what? Over 400 years of genocide. And it doesn't stop there. Now, the conservative student leader publishes an opinion piece in the National Post. We have two major national newspapers. I don't know which is worse, but National Post, the opinion piece, you can just click the link. And is it possible to send students the PDF file to this,
Yeah.
just so they can click on the links and read the whole thing themselves?
You can send me the
Sure.
slideshow.
All right. I can send you the latest version and then, yeah, cool. So, well, once something publishes, something gets published on a national newspaper, of course, the school starts, and the same student, by the way, who published the piece, lodged an official complaint with the university, and the university Senate Discipline initiated an investigation. And they found, after their investigation, that Khan had violated the university's code of conduct because her post was demeaning to people who identify as white. And okay, well, there are people too, they make decisions. We don't have to agree with their decisions, but they gave her the option to undergo counseling. And she was asked to write a reflective essay. And that's when I said, oh, this is so screwed up, to use a better language. So because it reminds me of places like North Korea, if you say something, oh, you're thinking this very wrong, so why don't you write a reflective essay and just tell us how wrong you were when you expressed these opinions. She refused both. So that's what I hope we will talk about, because all these laws, First Amendment rights, keeps you from going to jail. But they do not necessarily save you from trouble, but they give you at least the right to refuse university administration when they ask you to write reflective essays or undergo counseling. So that was, I guess, the first incident. Now, who heard about the Wilfred Laurier incident, which was, I guess, a month ago or two, maybe? One? All right. One of the teaching assistants conducted a tutorial to neutral. What happened was, well, on gender pronouns, she showed a video. Actually, it was from TVO, TV Ontario, a publicized debate. So there's nothing wrong about the debate, because two sides debated. One side was for using gender pronouns. On the other side was Jordan Peterson, the most famous professor in Canada probably nowadays, and he's against the use of gender pronouns, and he considers that compelled speech. So she did not take sides. She said, well, this is a debate, let's watch it just so you know both sides of the argument. And that was problematic because at least one student complained about the tutorial, and a committee of 3 faculty members put her into a room. She secretly recorded it. That's how we got to know about this, and it's on YouTube. For 4 to 5 minutes, they questioned her. They brought her to a point of crying. And then the point was, you cannot simply show two sides of the argument. In these sensitive cases, you must actively take one of the two sides and, bash on the other. It's like they said, you show.
Mr. Jeffy, please, I'll send you the link. You must listen to part of this. It's bone-chilling. It's the dialogue between the professors and the student. I'll send it to you because I've never seen anything like it. I thought I've seen it all. But, anyway, just wanted to interject.
It is. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't also believe in the afterwards when I saw some of my students thinking that what the university did was right. Anyways, so she said, well, it's like showing Hitler. Because you cannot show Hitler. Okay, that's what Hitler said. Let's listen to what he says. But I was lost there too. Why not? That's what Hitler said, just by showing it. Does it mean that I am sort of on the side of Hitler because I did not stop the video every 10 seconds and said something bad about Hitler? That's an insult to your intelligence, if you ask me. So, they told her basically that she was wrong to remain
Can you
neutral.
clarify what was the controversy about?
Well, one side says you must use gender pronouns such as ze or zer instead of her or him. Yeah, yeah. The other says this is compelled speech. If it becomes a part of the language, I will use it. You cannot compel me to say it. That's Canada. That's the greatest problem we have, you can say. For a lot of people, that's a luxury. I don't think so still. It's important. But the way to go about it is probably not that, not try to...
And she was compelled to be on the side of the people who say Z or...
Yes, you must, because gender is not a binary category. If some people don't want to use, some people want to keep using gender pronouns in binary, then we must react against this. We cannot remain neutral is the question. But she was not for or against. That's the issue.
Can I just mention the Jordan Peterson guy, because I don't think they know about the Peterson case.
Sure, sure.
Peterson is just a professor. He's a psychology professor. He's actually quite well known. And he's the one that he, in his classes, refused to use non-binary gender pronouns or be compelled to use them. So if a student came up to say, you need to say, call me Zay or Z or whatever it is, he'd say, well, I don't have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And she actually said, well, yes, you actually do, because, you know, it's demeaning to me if you don't. And they started pushing him. He started getting really pushed from the left. From the identity politics left, as I call it, getting pushed on being compelled to use the pronoun.
Yes.
So it became a really ridiculous, kind of weird case of him refusing to use a particular pronoun and feeling as if he was being compelled to do it.
He said other controversial things too.
And they started bringing in Rule 319 to try to bring him up on charges of demeaning non-gender, non-binary people. And that's when it became a real national issue, because it looked like they were going to try to use legislation to punish a professor for not compulsorily using gender-neutral pronouns, which
or take action that will result in him losing his tenure.
Losing his job. So it's like, I'll send you the, I didn't want to intervene too much, but I wanted to clarify the Peterson case. The Peterson's become a real flashpoint in Canada. He's now a kind of darling of the anti-whatever.
Yeah. So
But I'll send you the link to the post about what happened in the interrogation of the student. I'll send it to all of you right now.
So they asked her to submit all of her future lesson plans in advance, and they decided to also audit her tutorials to see what she's going to say in there. And after the issue became public, with her releasing the contents of her interrogation in at the university, well, there was a lot of reactions, so the university apologized. But the problem is, well, what happens when I'm teaching a course and actively taking one side? Last week, before I came here, less than a week ago, I covered the Clash of Civilizations theory of Samuel Huntington. Well, I did the exact same thing the TA did. I showed them two videos. The title said, "Is there a clash of civilizations?" So there was a yes video by the late Christopher Hitchens, and there was a no video by Robert Fisk. And then there was a list of Shades of Grey videos, which we did not cover. I asked the students to watch on their own time because we have limited time in the lecture. But by showing them the yes and no sides, I gave them the framework, and I indicated where they could also learn about the shades of gray. To me, that's instruction. Should I simply, if that is wrong, take one side and bash on the other in the academy? That should be, of course, I say there's no clash of civilizations. When it's a multifaceted issue, when it's an issue for which it is difficult to give a yes or no answer, that's only an introduction. The yes and no videos, and that's how it all starts. And then we debate about these things, and anything you should be able to say given that you are not rude toward one another or attack one another on the basis of background or anything that's irrelevant completely to the topic on debate. So that's, if I did this in any other way, then I would be alienating at least one group of students after I take that side. At least some of these students on the camp that I'm against will silence themselves. They will be more reluctant to speak their mind. That is not an environment for a fruitful debate. And what we have, if we do not have these fruitful debates, is we're going to have pseudo debates. Some views are not allowed. Only the views that we consider legitimate, we just talk about, not the shades of gray. We will take one particular shade of gray and talk about the tones of it. It will be, again, a pseudo debate. And although a lot of people like the word thought provocation, what we see in practice is that there's often very little room left for thought provocation because of the effort to be politically correct in some cases, but more so, I would say, more so the cases trying to silence opposing views. The first case that you saw here was a very right-wing position in Dalhousie. The second one you saw there in Wilfred Laurier was a very left-wing position. It's okay to be right or left-wing, of course, but the conservative students mentioned State University, but it's especially problematic to silence students on one side or the other when you're especially in a state university. And cognitive skills, if you have only been in a pseudo-intellectual environment where only pseudo-debates take place, then you will not really have the opportunity to develop your critical thinking skills, and that will not prepare you for real life, because in real life, real hate speech is way more common. So these are the four major issues that I saw with activist, non-neutral instruction. So now this was Canada and two very recent examples coming from campuses. In the United States, I will go very quickly. What do we see in the United States when it comes to restrictions of freedom of speech? I will only go over major milestones in the history of freedom of speech in the United States. Well, sedition, obscenity is one thing. The second U.S. Supreme Court case here is probably the most important in this context. Well, is it okay to distribute anti-draft flyers to young men? And the U.S. Supreme Court decided restriction of speech in wartime is constitutional, and it was a unanimous decision. Again, you click on the link, you go to learn about further details about this case. And this is when the clear and present danger test was introduced. And the second one, if you look at the second one in here, because I don't want to bore with all of these cases one from another, but I'm just highlighting the most important ones. Yates versus the United States. Is it okay, for example, to be a member of a communist party, which implies your intent to overthrow the U.S. government? And the U.S. Supreme Court decided that, well, yes, you can have communist views, but if you also exercise your freedom of organization, join, not to mention found a communist party, then that's problematic, a 6-1 decision. But actually, there are important issues at each point of history, and at these times, this is when these freedoms really matter, actually. Today, it is not really important if you have communist views. No, but when it's on the agenda, when more people have these views, that's when the U.S. Supreme Court decisions count. That's when they have more weight. it doesn't really change our lives to any significant degree if they reverse that decision today. Incitement of violence, well, the first one here, when the fighting words test was introduced, if you're not fighting physically, but you're using fighting words, like how this Jehovah's Witness called a police officer a fascist, a damned racketeer. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the First Amendment does not protect fighting words, and it was a unanimous decision. Now, but one can argue the whole idea of not, resorting to violence is that you fight with your words. So how can that be a problem? But again, it was a unanimous decision. I'm not saying that this was completely wrong or not, because yes, speech can turn into violence. But at these critical points or critical junctures of history, such decisions make a lot of difference. And all tend to favor the government's position, and we will see more of that. And when it comes to symbolic speech, the U.S. Supreme Court seems to be more pro-liberty, because in all of the three cases that I mentioned in here, it decides that, well, the government's interest in preserving the flag as a symbol does not outweigh the individual right to disparage that symbol. But be very careful, all were 5-4 decisions. So even the very act of burning the flag, which, the way I understand the First Amendment, which is what even the American idea is about, even that passes a 5-4 decision. If it was another president that was making a nomination, and it was a differently minded justice was sitting on the bench, then we would have a 4-5 decision, meaning that would reverse the decision. So that too, even these three decisions are pro on the side of liberty, that too is concerning, given that the decisions were made 5-4. And finally, hate speech. So what happens, for example, if you give a racist speech at a KKK rally, for example? That's the beauty of concrete review. Unlike Europe, in the United States, you guys have concrete. You start from actual cases to see what happened, and you apply it immediately, which makes it very interesting to read. So, some guy gives a speech at a KKK rally, mentions revenge against Jews, and in quotation, these are niggers. So the speech, so the decision is that speech that makes law violation imminent and likely is not constitutional. So this probably is one of the few cases where the Supreme Court of the United States sort of says, well, imminent, if a breach of the peace is imminent, then it's not constitutional. But abstract advocacy of force or law violation is constitutional. So again, decides eventually after making that remark that in this case that wasn't the case, and the whole decision tells us that if there's not an imminent danger, imminent lawless action, then you can say whatever you want about any minority. And hate speech, again, let's pick only one here, the most important one, probably, yes, the second one. So a KKK leader burns a cross on the lawn of an African-American family. Everyone is familiar with what that, if you burn a cross in front of the house of someone, it just means that we don't want you in this neighborhood, just leave. So they do that. Is that constitutional? So the decision says conviction for cross burning is unconstitutional unless the intent to intimidate is proven. And it's interesting. It's an 8-1 decision, and the only Supreme Court justice that is in dissent is the only African-American justice in the Supreme Court. So I will close with 2 more slides about our freedoms in the digital age. Now, when it comes to our freedoms, cultural freedoms and sexual freedoms, we see major advancements. If you have a different culture, if you belong to a sexual minority, then yes, it's probably a good time to be in 2018. But when it comes to political freedoms, we see a lot of declines. And we will talk more about this. But the bottom line is, if you exercise your right to free speech, what matters the most is that how the First Amendment will help you is that you will not go to jail. But you are increasingly likely to face serious consequences for speaking your mind. Someone tweets something, well, it's against the court. It's against our company culture, so you get laid off, for example. Even if you do this in a polite and constructive manner, it still can have some serious consequences. And there's also the surveillance issue. The government, once you do these things, the radar of the government will sort of find you, and you will be more closely monitored. I mean, each individual is monitored. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's a fact. Because digitally, it's more than possible to, read your emails, whatever you sent to someone. It's actually has a copy someplace else. Multiple governments do that, not just the U.S. government simultaneously. And U.S. ranks increasingly lower in the Freedom of the World Index. That's another thing that should worry us. But this was the last slide. I may perhaps conclude with this. All societies have their sensitivities. They have their concerns that are more primary than others, and that changes from time to time. If we remember some of the cases decided by the Supreme Court, at one point it was all about the Reds taking over the United States, the communist scare, all the scare about communism. But then, well, at one point in early, after the turn of the millennium, probably, it was the Balkan Serbs you saw on 24 terrorists from the Balkans. Now it's the Muslims. Well, different sensitivities, and at different points in history, governments make different regulations, and courts make different decisions about these sensitivities. We in the West always talk about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, despite all of these problems that I just mentioned. In other parts of the world, like the Muslim world, there are other sensitivities. Drawing a cartoon of the Prophet is one of them. So that's what happens in some, if not many, Muslim contexts. What happens is, well, once something like that happens, the courts, the legislatures respond accordingly. So on a more abstract level, freedom of speech is probably about putting our sensitivities aside, at least to a certain degree, because once we have those, we always see the government or the courts, which is a part of government, restricting these freedoms, and it only looks more horrible to us when it's on the other side of the fence. If that because we don't have that sensitivity in the first place. We did not grow up with it. We don't really care if it is one religious leader or the other that's in a cartoon. But if you go back, if you go to the other side of the fence, they will say similar things. That is not to say that the freedom of speech is not important, but that is to say, freedom of speech is restricted by different means in Western contexts, some of which I mentioned. So this may perhaps be a point of departure for the Q&A, but of course you're more than welcome to ask me any questions about any of the slides if you want me to elaborate on them. So that's basically it. You don't need to raise hands, really. You can simply talk, but don't fight. Just say something.
Raise hands.
Raise hands, really?
We have law and order.
I outlaw that in my classes. I just say, to just speak, because if they speak at the same time,
We don't have complete freedom.
really, you have a long way to go. So because Canada is number 4 in the Freedom of the World Index that just came out. Yeah.
So going back to the incident at Wilfred Laurier, I'm curious as to your thoughts, because when I hear that a professor did that, I don't see that as like showing like two sides of a
TA.
a TA doing that. I don't know if I see that as like synonymous to presenting like two sides of an academic argument, so much as like if you gave like equal credence to like white supremacists and like the NAACP, and you presented those side by side and said these are two legitimate academic perspectives, because within the classroom, at least, a primary responsibility of a TA or a professor should be to be respectful to their students. And I guess I just can't see this as like a purely like academic freedom thing, like the right to like disrespect a student's wishes in the classroom, like and just like intentionally misgender them, but like present that as like an issue of academic freedom. I'm just kind of curious as to like your thoughts on that.
One thing in the beginning, she did not say both of these arguments have equal validity. And the whole point of having a free discussion is that you do not place any validity on any of the arguments that you propose, and just ask the class, or at least that's what I do, because I was not there when she, because most of them seem to agree, even those who interrogate her on the issue that she simply presented both sides of the argument. She simply presented a televised debate, part of a televised debate. If she did that, though, if she said, both of these arguments have equal weight, that to me is the same as taking one side. What if some of the students think, well, they do not have equal weight? And that's the whole point of having a debate, because of course we will think that's one of the two has some more debate, just so we have that debate. It's already decided in the first place by the professor or the TA. What's the point of having? Is the TA going to fight with the students about how to go about this, which one is right, which one is wrong? If she did that, I would criticize that equally, because that's the same thing. It's not about which is right, which is wrong. It's about, according to me, of course, you don't have to agree with this, just simply not put anything there. Well, this is what they talked about. What do you think? We tend to instruct. We tend to, most people in my profession, just try to present things from their own perspectives, when in fact, just ask what the students think. Aren't you a bit curious about, especially, some professors, there are like 2 or 3 generational differences between the students and them, in the case of very old professors. So aren't you curious about what the millennials are thinking about this issue, at least what percent of the classroom is standing where, and what happened to learning from students? I would like to be, especially in this age when the change is exponential, I would like to learn more from students than otherwise, always being one-sided. Yep.
So I go back to one of the readings stated, and I found this really fascinating, that explicitly in the Quran it's not mentioned that there's a ban on images of the Prophet Muhammad. Am I correct in this? And if so, if that's not the case, where there's no ban on specific images, how did the evolution of sort of this ban on images of the Prophet Muhammad come to be so prevalent in the Muslim world?
Well, several schools have thought about this, but you're right, and I have a section about this in my book because until 1500s, we see Prophet Muhammad depicted by Muslims themselves. And I included them in the book. That's the only image of Muhammad you will see in the book. After the 1500s, it became customary not to include, they say, but my theory is that it became the norm after the movie The Message, which did not depict it. And most Muslims, I don't want to speak for 1.6 billion Muslims in the world like I know what they think, but my guess is that most Muslims, their knowledge about the Prophet does not go very far from what's included in that movie, The Message, 1976, starring Anthony Quinn. So it's the popular knowledge, like most people. You may have come across many strong Christians who have not read the Bible from cover to cover, but keep reading many other books when they keep claiming that this is the #1 book that people should read over and over again. So that's the same thing the same is the case for Muslims. So my guess is that it's 1976. The Message, the film, made that a norm in the Muslim community because all Muslims around the world watch that movie time and time again, actually, and say, well, the Prophet is not depicted there. Not in voice, not in, nobody plays the character. They just speak to a person. You just see nothing. So that is my theory. But if you have any other,
Can I add something?
yeah, you may probably say something about that.
I mean, the ban on Prophet Muhammad being depicted is not in the Quran, but in the Sunni tradition, it became illegal. I mean, the Quran doesn't define the whole legal
But
tradition.
when
of
did it
Islam.
become
So there's a
illegal?
post-Quran, huh?
When though? In the past it wasn't. So,
The
because her question
images
is
of
when?
Prophet Muhammad that exist are from the Shia tradition, typically, the Persian.
All of
in the
them?
Sunni, that's what I know. And in the Sunni world, it's been a taboo.
Oh,
And Sunnis
yeah,
don't
by the way.
typically- But it was not an issue because nobody did it. So, and I think the cartoons bring that up and violate that. Plus, it's not just his image; it's also ridiculing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's mocking. So it's depicting plus in a kind of negative light. I mean, at least as it's perceived from the other side. In any case, I mean, Muslims should of course be cool about this compared to that, but
Yeah.
that's the background. But in the Quran, if you just look at the Quran, you can say, and I think it came from the idea of banning Prophet Muhammad having images comes from the idea that he should not be turned into an idol. In Judaism, you have also ban on graven images. Like, we don't want to be like the idolaters, so we don't want to depict them. So that
Yeah,
would be-
if I may add one more thing to this. When most people talk about Muslims, they actually talk about, or Islam, they talk about Sunni Islam, which Sunnis are 90%, so they get to define Islam. But in the Shiite tradition, imagery is not a problem. In general, Sunnis are a bit distance themselves from all kinds of imagery. But in the Shiite tradition, imagery, statues, everything, they're quite fine. So that's another important distinction. Yep.
Sort of on the same wavelength as the gender debate, or the gender pronouns debate. There's an issue of the New York Times. They published an article, I think it was called The Nazis Next Door or something like that. It was basically one journalist's portrayal of a white supremacist, and it got a lot of flack for not being radical enough. So not like strongly criticizing white
Was that about the publisher of this far right-wing journal? I forgot the name. There's this now the guy with the bald head who was in the past a vegetarian, but then he became this really hateful.
There was another article
Another
about the
article.
publisher of Breitbart. I think I
Not
know
Breitbart.
the one you're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
I know
this
what you're
was-
talking about, but
it's
it's,
just
it's
about
not
a
Richard
guy.
Spencer, it's just a random guy in Ohio.
Oh,
I
not
think.
Richard Spencer. That's not, okay.
Yeah, it is.
Oh yeah, it's probably the guy. Yeah, Ohio.
There was a separate one about Richard Spencer,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
was a little bit more acerbic
Yeah.
in tone.
So they criticize it for not being strong about.
For not being radical enough.
Yeah.
Do you think that, I guess, in that sphere, do you think that journalists and people who write about white supremacists, about, people who might have minority opinions, have a responsibility to take one side or another?
I think they all have a responsibility to freely express what they really think rather than doing what other people ask them to do. That's on the very center of freedom of speech. If that answers your question.
Because it's important. The fundamental basis of social science and sociology and anthropology, the way I was trained in it and as a social science, is what we call disinterestedness. And what that means is that you're very interested in the phenomenon, but when you approach it, you need to approach it as an object, as something to be understood. So, you know, if you're a sociologist, and I'm a sociologist who studies war crimes I've interviewed war criminals, and you know, of course I hate war criminals. You know, of course I want to speak out against war crimes as a human rights activist, but as a sociologist, I wanted to find out why these people did what they did. And you know, that's what you do when you're a sociologist. And you know, and you have to kind of develop this at least this is, I think, very important these days, because the idea that somehow if you teach about white supremacy, you need to go on a long rant and rave about how terrible it is and all that. Of course you could do that, but as a sociologist, the first imperative would be to try to understand why these people became white supremacists, you know, and try to understand why they do what they do. And there is actually a sociologist, I don't know if he's still around, but his name is James Aho, A-H-O. And this is way back when. You know, white supremacy is nothing new in the United States. It's always been there. He went out as a sociologist and infiltrated these white supremacist camps in Idaho. And he showed up. He was a white guy, luckily for him, you know. But he showed up and, you know, he said, look, I'm here to understand why you guys are out here in the woods with machine guns, and grenades, and bulletproof vests, and all that. And he, you know, he kind of infiltrated the group. And he was very honest that he was a professor at the University of Idaho. And he wrote a long series of books that was trying to understand these guys. And he wasn't empathetic. He didn't say, oh, you should really understand the pains they feel. It was more like, you know, why are you like this? And if you don't have that in sociology or social science, if you don't have that neutrality, you can't really understand anything.
But maybe her question was more along the lines of should a journalist act more like a sociologist in this case, or not? And I would say,
I think there are different modalities. You could write an op-ed saying these people are awful and here's why, or you could write and say, you know, why do people turn into this? What's your theory of that? And by doing that, you're not giving them any kind of I mean, one of the best studies ever done in sociology was right after World War II, when a German sociologist interviewed former members of the SS, the Gestapo. Why did you join that unit? You know, why did you do that? And they had their reasons. And he was an anti-Nazi himself. He was actually Jewish. But he managed to get himself in the room and try to understand. I may be going on a little too long about this, but I think it's crucial that the understanding of students, at least in terms of analysis, is that analysis is one thing, and presenting the views of Jordan Peterson is for somebody like that is just merely presenting him as a phenomenon. He exists. He's having an effect around him, and you're really not. You're not making any statements for and against him. You're just saying he's a leader of this movement, and here's the opposition. And that's an objectivity and neutrality. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to do. I just wanted to throw that in because that's some of what I heard. But go ahead.
Yeah, just to respond to what Professor Cushman said. I think there's a difference in academic writing and journalistic writing. Like in academics, it's very important to remain neutral. But the consensus has been in reporting and journalism that there's always going to be a bias. So you need to address your own place within the context of the story that you're telling and admit to your bias. And there's no need to act as though you have no, kind of interest or even stake in the story being told. So, there's neutrality in academic writing, of course, because that's how we understand these phenomenons. But journalism isn't how we understand these phenomenons, it's how we interact with them.
So what you're saying that whenever you watch a news story, you want the reporters to say, I agree with X, Y, and Z?
No, but I want them to say, well, I will admit, as a such and such, I have this stake in the claim, so here's a little preliminary caution. I have this kind of bias, so if you find my reporting bias, this is why.
Well,
one thing, if I can interject a concept here, no one will ever be completely bias-free, but in some legal practices, especially in the school of realism in legality, what you're striving for is impartiality, which, by some definitions, is literally not leaving out any part. So, the idea behind impartiality is that all of us make decisions all the time, which are important, judges especially, but all of us. Sociologists no less than journalists. And so when you're striving to make the best decision possible and to respect the expectations of your audience and the differing views and various information that you are being presented with, what is basically required of you is not to make your decision until you've seen all of the information. And so I would say, personally, I think journalists have an obligation to impartiality. They do not have an obligation to state or operate on their biases, because perhaps I'm nostalgic here, but I would actually prefer if journalists worked harder to overcome their biases. Even if that may be impossible to completely do, the effort is usually worthwhile.
Yeah, and maybe you should not assume too much about academics, because they can also be very biased, actually. And
It said that academics should be
But
neutral,
at least
so
that's-
it wasn't like
that's
assuming that they should be neutral. It was just said that in an ideal world, academics is neutral. It wasn't-
Neutrality and objectivity are very
And
different things. That we can get into that.
And there's at least this principle right in the middle, very central to our profession, that we must at least do our best to remain unbiased. But Thomas Kuhn's book about scientific revolutions, it's all about recognizing, coming face to face with our own biases. Yep.
And I think understanding biases, especially in the journalistic world, is especially a huge kind of topic in today's society, because you have, our presidential administration who can denounce anything as, oh, this is fake news, because obviously they're out to get me. And that in itself is a certain bias. Or, you should only listen to these guys because they really get the facts, or they really know the facts. Well, maybe every single news source that you read has the same facts at the end of the day, but it's all on how they spin it, right? So it could be like, oh my gosh, 30 people died. Or it could be like, only 30 people died, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
right? So understanding that difference, I think, is the essence of journalism. And I think hopefully as a society we can see that and we can move past that and kind of hopefully boil things down to the facts and make our own opinions based off of it.
I was actually wondering if, given your decision to leave the website that refused to publish the articles that you wanted to on the cartoons, and then your decision to actually publish with more independence your own book, if you could comment a bit more on, I guess, the role of institutions and sort of distancing themselves from maybe an individual who is expressing a certain opinion, and sort of how that relates to the freedom of speech debate.
It was not the institution distancing itself from myself. In this case, I distanced myself, like you already said. And I simply found it pointless to publish a content analysis of cartoons, which I cannot include in the analysis. So it didn't make any sense to me, so I left. Institutions, of course, if it was the New York Times, could I make that decision very quickly? So I don't want to flatter myself. Oh, they restricted me, so I left. So I would probably act differently. So it's easy to say that. That's why I didn't want to accept all these praises about me. Because people act differently. If it was the New York Times, I would probably give in a little, at least a little, because I did not give in one bit in their case. I replied the message quite quickly, actually. If you do, we're very sorry, this, that, but if you can do these changes, of course we will more than blah, blah, blah. I said, sorry, I don't want to write for, it's probably time for me to say bye. So I said something like that. Very short message. But of course institutions matter a lot, because when we think about the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Washington Post, can you imagine how wider your audience is going to be if you publish your piece in there, as opposed to a website that or any other website? But So yeah, of course, and that's the problem actually to a certain degree, and we see a change for good with the rise of the internet, because we don't have only just a bunch of newspapers nowadays. We also have lots of websites too. Like if you have also Vice News and Slate right next to the New York Times, that's only a change for good. I don't know if that answers your questions, but short answer is yes, they do matter.
So, I actually meant a little bit more in terms of, when you have, an organization that, since they wanted you to make some changes to the content that you wanted to put forward.
No, just nothing to the content, just not publish the cartoons.
Right, okay, so, do you think that falls within their own, freedom of speech?
That's what I thought.
Right, okay.
But of course they will have their justifications. And we had a debate about it in the afterwards in our group. I don't want to disclose the contents, of course, because it was a private debate, but nothing they said made any sense to me whatsoever, especially given what we set out to do in the first place. Anyone who did not speak? You didn't speak, okay.
Okay, thank you for coming today. I just had a clarifying question. On the last slide, you mentioned that you believe that political freedoms are declining. Do you think that it's only possible that political freedoms are declining because we have so much more political freedom now than we have ever had before?
I don't
every
think that.
person has a huge platform at the touch of their fingertips that people didn't have before, so there's more range to be, I guess, have your political freedoms declining than there was in the past?
Well, we all have small platforms now, not huge platforms. Some people always had. Some people always had huge platforms. It's in the sense of having Vice News and Slate next to New York Times, but also some people whose blogs have become very popular, for example. So yes, that gives you a voice. But the part that I emphasized here is that yes, you can express yourself, and if you can really make a difference, you will find more readers. And the First Amendment will help you not go to jail. Certain restrictions apply, of course, yeah. But the fine print says. The real issue, perhaps, is that's also a case for Canada because of more recent legislations. It is also true that what you say will be monitored. There may be consequences if you strum on a very sensitive chord. So that's what I am, I guess, saying in here. I'm not saying we have. I say in the previous one, you probably mean this one, that when I say political freedoms are declining, it's when you become troubled when you see, I become troubled when I see such incidents in university campuses or journalists facing certain criticisms like that. So that's basically what I mean. And I also say in the next slide that, yeah, if you do this, well, not going to jail is not enough for me. Maybe that's why I think that. If you say something, and if you don't incite violence, or if you don't incite hatred against anyone, but you still face consequences, that's a problem. Because if someone is laid off, fired, because of their sexual identity, okay, if we use that term, then we find it problematic. We all agree. But if someone is fired simply because of a view that does not incite violence, it's just in some way not to the liking of some people, I find that equally problematic if someone was fired because of being homosexual. That's how I would elaborate on this. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep.
So yeah, the reason I brought up the New York Times article earlier was in part because I'm wondering how much responsibility people have for their views being misinterpreted. For example, so with the white supremacist article, I personally thought it was really interesting, but there are people out there who read it and thought oh, white supremacists aren't that bad, which was not the author's point of view. But like, if the author's work created that, I guess that feeling or that opinion, are they to blame for that?
I can give you my personal opinion. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
I think we hate most people. I think we hate them because we don't know that much about them. Even if it's a hateful group, if you get to know more about them, you will hate them less probably. Think about racists. Every family has one, no? I mean, if every family had only one, that would be a much better world actually. Most families have way more than one. But we don't really think about that racist uncle that talks about this and that every Thanksgiving dinner. Do you hate that person? No. It's, it's Uncle Bill talking again. But if it's about people you don't know, especially in the case of Muslims today, as it was in the past, about Catholics to a certain degree, we don't know them. It's easier to hate them. Or if we know white people, well, we don't know a lot of KKK people, so it's easier to hate them. Now, once I say this, it's going to be a bit controversial, but it's true. So I have to say it in freedom. That's the point, right? So if you get to know these people, the only way to convince them that, this doesn't really make sense, you need to get to know them first. And in the process, if you hate them less, so be it. Were you expecting to solve the problem with more hatred? No. So what's the problem with less hatred? Let's hate them less, think about this issue, let it swirl around our heads a little, and then talk with these people. What's wrong with that? If somebody just writes an article about them, spends time with them in an anthropological or for sociological reasons, that's only good. How can more knowledge be bad? So that would be my personal answer to this, based on the premise that, well, we hate less when we know more about people, the racist Uncle Billy being the example. Yep.
But more to the point of what people's actions, like in response to your speech, is, and like actual speech. I think in the article, one of the cartoons, with the, I think it was about the cartoon with the turban and the bomb. Like the artist later said, apologized and said, I only meant it like for specific extremists. But like most people who viewed that wouldn't really understand that nuance. Like I didn't really see where that nuance was. To what point is it, the artist saying like, oh, but I didn't mean that, and then like what most people see in response to that, even if it's not what the artist intended?
Yeah, that's a very good question actually. And when conducting the content analysis in my book, I also, would that constitute hate speech? Would that be problematic? The only one that I found problematic of all of these cartoons in Charlie Hebdo, Yılın Postan, or else, was that particular one, because it implies that, this is what Islam teaches, this is how all Muslims are. That may not be the intention, but a lot of people are likely to get that impression. And that was the only one I underlined, and I was very happy afterwards when I read an academic article published very recently that analyzed the same 12 cartoons, and he reached the same conclusion that that was the only one problematic, and in a free society, all of the other 11 cartoons should be freely published. But the artist, the other part of your question, it depends on the artist, of course. Some people may be stubborn about it and say, no, that's what I meant. But it's not very difficult if you approach people differently. You can say, I think Kurt is the name, I forgot the last name of that cartoonist. So, I mean, if you do this like that, but a lot of people are going to pursue it in that fashion, and let me explain to you why. And if that person is reasonable, which I believe most people are, then it's easier to solve these problems. So neither right nor left wing violence or authoritarianism is going to solve any of our problems. I hope that answers your questions, but
Sort of just about where the line between intention and people's response to that. Like if someone published something that caused people to riot and like commit commit crime or something, but it wasn't their intention to cause that, can you use should
in
that
law,
speech be limited?
in law, there's a lawyer in the room. I don't know who. Okay, in law, intentions do not always count. Am I correct?
Yeah, at least in the incitement context, if you don't have the intent, it's sort of a safe harbor. So even if your words are likely to lead to imminent lawless conduct, if your intent wasn't to produce imminent lawless conduct, then your speech is protected. I think because we don't want people chilled from speaking because of fear of accidentally bringing about some harmful conduct.
Thank you. Did you speak for you?
No, I haven't spoken yet.
That's why.
Yeah, so I think, of course, impartiality is very important when it comes to discussing issues, but also the choosing of words matters so much. So there was a documentary about Trump voters in McDowell County, Virginia, which is I think it's West Virginia, sorry, and it's one of the poorest areas in the country. So there was a man there who was running to be a Democrat. I think it was like for the House of Reps or something, or it might have been just a city position. And so he came up to one of the houses, and this one guy, like the guy at the house, heard that he was a Democrat. He's like, I don't want to talk to you. But then when the guy running for office was like, I'm the son of a coal miner, the guy was likely to listen. He even took his brochure. So I think it's very important to consider the situation that people come from and to take that into account, before, discussing an issue.
I was just saying, going back to what we're talking about, I think I'm surprised that the cartoon that people aren't talking about is the one where it's apparently Muhammad and he's got the bar across his eyes and he's carrying the scimitar and he's got the two women behind him. It was another one of the 12. I'm surprised that people don't talk about that, because when I look at that picture, to me that seems like it's inciting violence against women. It almost seems. I don't know if you can see it very well in the picture. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you all the way back. It's the one, the lower left-hand corner almost, the one right on top of that. So that, to me, I guess, to posit it to maybe our dear lawyer in the room, is that the definition of inciting violence and hatred, or is that...
Though, before anyone says anything, what did you understand from this particular cartoon?
To me, it seems like the cartoonist wanted to imply that Muslims are inherently violent. To me, it seems like he's a very angry man. He's got these two women kind of behind him, and he's got this scimitar.
I understood it differently. I don't know which one of us is right, but to me, the black band on the eyes fits sort of the eyes of the women back there, and I think this is about the suppression of women in Muslim societies or some conservative Muslim circles, as opposed to when we should not worry about these two women, we talk about whether the face is visible or not. I don't know, that's what I got from it. I'm not saying I'm right, but you may weigh in on this if... Yep.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's trying to say that, like, it's blind to force women to cover up when, like, forcing them to cover up is, like, the thing that's blinding.
Because, the black band...
Yeah, because it fits in perfectly.
Black band on male, or in this case, the prophet, just means that what we're talking about, whether we should depict a face or not. But on women, it means something else. You can only see the eyes. And in some cases, you cannot even see the eye if it's a burqa, for example.
So what about the scimitar in this? I think that's the thing I'm probably really kind of not disturbed, but I'm kind of questioning. Like, is the scimitar necessary?
Scimitar, the dagger, you mean, right?
The dagger thing, yes.
Oh, that's what... All right, now I see what you mean. Oh, okay, all right. And that may Well, yeah, that's the.
Trying to talk about women being covered up, I don't think that's necessary in the context of the cartoon. But I think when someone asks, hey, draw a picture of Muhammad, and this is what he came up with, I
Yeah,
think
it is-
that's the kind of
There's
questioning part in my mind. I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but I was.
Can I add something to
Yeah,
that?
sure.
This is very interesting. If you are from Yemen, for example, you wouldn't see anything offensive in this cartoon. Men carry daggers all the time. That's what they do. And yes, they're married to more than one woman, and women walk behind them. So, I mean, to us, from the Western perspective, oh, this shows that men are oppressing women, or men walk in front of women and they're
Or
behind.
that Muhammad himself
Yes, but
supports the religion.
but that's how they. I mean, some societies already are like that, and they think this is normal. And of course, Muslim feminists would argue, no, Prophet Muhammad wasn't actually like this. You're just imposing your own patriarchy to him back in time. So that's a nice argument I like to as well. And how he exactly was, of course, a big discussion. But what looks as offensive to you in this cartoon would be offensive from someone from Istanbul or Bosnia as well, probably a more, let's say, egalitarian society. But if you're Saudi, yeah, a woman walk behind you, and you can have several of them as their wives.
The sword is on
And
the
care-
flag anyways.
And yeah, the sword is in your flag anyway, so it's not. But it's interesting that you find that offensive, whereas
I
that
think
would
it's
not
like
be offensive.
I'm just
for-
imagining this Danish cartoonist thinking like, all right, I'm thinking Muhammad right now, like, all right, this is what I'm at. Like that's the first thing that pops
But
into
that
his
was
head.
the experiment.
Danish doesn't mean that.
But
We
that
don't know
was-
anything about him except that he lives in
The,
Denmark.
the,
I
the,
thought
the,
they had
the
an
one at the
article
top was
about
found offensive because it depicts a bomb.
Right.
So it connects Islam to terrorism right from the image of Prophet Muhammad. Saudis or Yemenis would say we're not terrorists too. But if you say you're patriarchal, they will say, yeah, of course, and that's the way it is. So there's not a problem there.
Okay, that's interesting.
And I think it brings the question to we as Western society depicting, say, the Muslim world, do we have the right to critique the practices that are already in the Muslim world? And I think that's a really fundamental question that also ties in with the cartoons. And
It's their culture argument, but when it's female genital mutilation, which a minority of Muslims practice, of course nobody says that. It's their culture. So what? We cannot allow this. In other things, can we?
wife burning.
In India, sati. So there's certain things that people, I think, feel inclined to be flexible about, and others which, that's completely out of question. We cannot allow this, something like that. At least that's what I'm saying. But yeah. Any other questions? We have 2 more minutes. Yep.
Yes, I was just going to say that the answer to the question, do we as Westerners have the right to judge other cultures, can be broken down into like the moral argument and also the free speech argument. From a free speech perspective, you might well conclude we have the right in free speech to do it, but that doesn't mean that we have the moral standing or the credibility to do it.
But if there are sizable groups of Muslims living in Western countries, they also become a part of the rules apply to them too. So what happens is when they ask for exemption for certain issues, that's when, you cannot, it's not simply a matter of our normative views about that particular activity, but also about how we're going to be able to live together in a society. And how can we all be happy about this? So that's when things become a little more complicated because, of course, on the one hand, you cannot allow MGM, but what about in Europe, this is more problematic than in North America. What if some parents talk to school administrators and ask for exemptions for her daughters for swimming classes, for example? Is that sufficient grounds to when someone cites religious reasons for exemption? Is that sufficient? Should that be sufficient or not? This is how the debate is going on right now, and it's anytime one issue becomes salient. Of course, the media likes that because it draws a lot of attention. increases the ratings, but does it, how do they solve the problem in different ways in different countries? Any other questions? Last few seconds. All right. All right. Thank you then.
Thank you so much.